It began as nothing more than a curiosity. I had recently inherited an old, decrepit house from a relative I had barely known, a great aunt, someone I had only met once when I was a child. The house was isolated, perched on a craggy hill that overlooked the mist-covered valley below. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged in places. The garden, which had once been lush, had long since fallen into neglect, the vines and weeds now strangling the life out of anything that had once flourished there. The place felt like a forgotten memory, a relic from another time, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I was drawn to it. The house had an oppressive atmosphere about it, an unspoken heaviness that seemed to hang in the air like a dense fog. But despite its age and decay, I couldn't help but be fascinated by it. The house was mine now, and it was time to figure out its secrets. It wasn't until the third day of living there that I found the door. It was in the basement, hidden behind a false wall, concealed so well that I hadn't even noticed it when I first explored the house. The room had been abandoned, covered in layers of dust, the air stale and thick with the scent of mildew. I had been clearing the area to use it as storage, when I accidentally bumped into what I thought was just an old piece of furniture. It wasn't. It was a part of the wall, a section that could be pushed aside to reveal a narrow wooden door. The door was unlike any I had ever seen. Its frame was intricate, carved with symbols I couldn't identify. The wood was dark and polished, despite the decades of neglect around it. The door stood alone in the middle of the stone walls of the basement, as if it didn't belong there. Curiosity got the best of me. I reached for the handle, but before I could grasp it, I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine. It was as though the house itself had shuddered in warning. But I ignored the feeling, dismissing it as nothing more than the house settling. I tried the door. It was locked, but the keyhole wasn't standard, strange, and unfamiliar in design. There were no obvious locks, no key to be found. I couldn't understand how such a door could exist in a house that had been seemingly untouched for years. For days, I searched the house, trying to find something that could explain the sealed door. There were no clues, no hints, just silence. And then the knocking started. It was subtle at first, a quiet tapping that echoed faintly through the walls. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe the wind causing the old timbers to shift. But each night, it grew louder, more distinct, more urgent. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my imagination. But each night, the knocking came closer, until it was no longer just a sound. It became a presence, a force that vibrated through the house. One evening, I could take it no longer. I made my way down to the basement, my heart pounding, the noise echoing in my ears. I stood before the door again, staring at its strange carvings, its unnerving presence. That's when it happened. The knocking came again, but this time it was not from inside the walls. It was coming from the door itself. The first knock was a soft thud, like a knuckle tapping against wood. Then another, and another, each one louder, more insistent. It felt like something was trying to get in. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to leave the house behind and never return. But the other part of me, the part that had been drawn to the mystery, to the strange allure of the house, wanted to know what was on the other side. I pressed my ear to the door. The knocking stopped. But then a voice, a low whisper, barely audible, coming from the other side. "Let me out." I recoiled, panic surging through me. The voice was deep, guttural, like it had been trapped for centuries, begging for release. I didn't know what to do, what was real anymore. In the silence that followed, I stood there frozen, listening. And then it happened. The door creaked open. The lock turned by itself, slowly, as if guided by an unseen hand. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My body was locked in place, my feet planted to the floor, my eyes wide in terror. The door inched open, the darkness beyond swallowing all light. But as the door swung wider, I saw something. A figure standing just beyond the threshold. It was a man, or rather, what used to be a man. His skin was pale, stretched thin over the bones, his eyes dark pools of emptiness. His hair hung in matted strands, and his clothes were torn, as if he had been trapped for an eternity. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed to pierce into my very soul. The air grew colder, the silence deafening. And then, as if from nowhere, the voice whispered again. "You let me out." I screamed, turning to run, but before I could take a step, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the house. The knocking started again, louder this time, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And then nothing. Complete silence. I turned back to the door, heart racing, too terrified to breathe. But the door was once again sealed. The locks were back in place. The carvings on the wood now seemed to pulse with an eerie light, faint but undeniable. I didn't know what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Had the house played some twisted game with my mind? The knocking stopped, but the silence was worse than any sound could be. The next day I left. I couldn't stay there any longer. Not with that door. Not with the things I had heard and seen. But as I packed my things, I found something strange. In the bottom of an old drawer, I discovered a key, an ancient, rusted key with no label, no explanation. I didn't know what it opened, but I knew one thing for certain. It would never touch that door again. The house is still there, perched on its hill, the sealed door still hiding its secrets. I don't know what happened in that room. I don't know if the thing behind the door is still there, still waiting. But I know this, some doors are better left closed. Some things are better left forgotten. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees at night, I hear it, the knocking, just beyond the sealed door.